In the quiet dawn of autumn, the air felt peculiar, humming with a heaviness most didn't notice but left some unsettled, as if a shadow had fallen over the world, unnoticed in the rush of ordinary lives. Dr. Ethan Ward couldn't shake the feeling, the odd itch in his mind that something sinister lay just beyond his reach, taunting him like an itch he couldn't scratch. As a microbiologist at the forefront of infectious disease research, Ethan was no stranger to intuitions that nudged him toward buried truths. His work was, after all, a science of glimpsing into the invisible, uncovering what most couldn't see or understand. But this feelingness was different. It crawled through him, and every evening he returned home to his family with an unease that tightened his chest and echoed in his wife's worried glances. Then it happened. It started with strange reports coming in from Europe and quickly rippling across the world. A viral outbreak was spreading, swift and ruthless, attacking without any sign or reason. First, people reported mild headaches and an odd sensitivity to light, symptoms that progressed within hours to an agonizing pain behind the eyes. And then, a darkness would settle, like a curtain falling, smothering the world into a thick and inescapable blackness. Within a week, the virus had a name, Null. It was an all-consuming black veil, robbing people of sight and leaving them stranded in eternal darkness. Panic grew as experts scrambled to understand the virus structure, its origin, and most terrifyingly, its trajectory. Cases surged in waves, relentless and uncontainable, swallowing city after city, plunging the world into a blindness that seemed irreversible. Ethan sat hunched in his dimly lit lab, working tirelessly with his team to untangle the virus intricacies. Despite their efforts, Null's biology eluded them. Its RNA sequencing was an anomaly, something had never seen before. The virus infiltrated the optic nerve, burrowing itself into cells in a way that defied any familiar patterns. Within hours, the infection spread to the central nervous system, rendering vision useless. Despite their advances, the team's findings were sparse, leaving them with an undeniable fact: they were out of time. Ethan's only comfort was the thought of his family. His wife, Lena, and his 7-year-old daughter, May, had fled to his parents' house in the mountains, far from the dense population centers where Null was spreading like wildfire. But the more he worked, the more he wondered if distance would be enough. Would anywhere truly be safe? Over the weeks, Null tightened its grip on humanity. Hospitals overflowed with patients in the throes of blindness, clawing at their eyes in desperate attempts to stave off the encroaching dark. Stories emerged of people throwing themselves from windows, of entire families sitting, helpless, in pitch-black isolation, their eyes wide and staring into an eternity they couldn't comprehend. Societies collapsed as communication faltered. With no way to see, cities became labyrinths of twisted metal and blood-streaked streets. In his lab, Ethan watched his colleagues succumb one by one, their desperate attempts at treatment failing before the merciless advance of Null. Each loss was a brutal reminder of how fleeting time had become. He saw on their expressions the same fear he tried to mask, the same horror of knowing that any of them could be next. And then one evening, as he buried himself in research, Ethan's phone vibrated. It was a video call from Lena. "Ethan?" Her voice wavered as her face flickered on the screen, shadowed and pale. "Lena, what is it?" His stomach twisted at her expression, something between terror and resignation, a look he had only seen once before when their daughter had been born. Her first cries thin and fragile as they rushed her to the ICU. That helplessness, that primal fear, echoed now in Lena's sighs. "It's May," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Ethan," she says she can't see. He could barely process the words, each syllable reverberating like a distant scream in his mind. He clenched the edge of the desk, fighting the urge to scream, to throw something, anything to shatter the horrible stillness that had settled in him. "I'm coming home," he said, his voice hoarse, each word pulled from the depths of a panic he couldn't afford to feel. Ethan's journey home was a blur. Cities were ghost towns, vacant streets littered with abandoned cars and remnants of people who had once filled them. The silence was oppressive, the world reduced to whispers of movement and the far-off sounds of animals reclaiming the land. When he reached the house, Lena was waiting on the porch, her face a portrait of grief. In her arms was May, her face hidden in the crook of her mother's neck, her little hands gripping tight. Ethan took his daughter in his arms, cradling her small, trembling frame. Her once bright eyes were clouded over, empty, unseeing. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice tiny and uncertain. "Why can't I see you?" He swallowed, his throat tight. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Daddy's right here." From that day, the house became a sanctuary of darkness. Windows were boarded up, and Lena took to navigating rooms by memory, using strings tied from one place to another as a guide. They learned to live in the dark, their lives slowing, every movement, every sound, a careful consideration. Ethan worked around the clock, his lab now set up in their basement, a patchwork of equipment and makeshift tools to continue his desperate pursuit of a cure. But Null was merciless, evolving faster than he could study it. His notes grew chaotic, his sketches frantic, as he chased answers that remained just out of reach. He was losing track of time, days blending into nights, the dark consuming more than just the sky. One evening, as he scrawled furiously in his notebook, Lena entered the basement, her footsteps hesitant. He looked up, noting the exhaustion etched into her features, the hollowness of her eyes. She reached out, her hand resting on his shoulder, a touch both comforting and filled with a grief too heavy to name. "Ethan," she whispered, "you need to come upstairs." He hesitated, his mind tangled in the complex sequences and dead ends, but something in her tone pulled him, and he rose, following her to May's room. Their daughter lay in bed, her face pale, her breath shallow. She had stopped speaking, her world reduced to a silent darkness that even her parents' love couldn't penetrate. Ethan sat beside her, holding her tiny hand in his, fighting back tears as he murmured words she couldn't hear, promises he couldn't keep. As he held her, he felt the bitter edge of defeat gnaw at him, the realization that Null wasn't something he could outsmart. It was a force, a black tide that swept away everything it touched, leaving nothing but shadows. When May's breathing slowed and her small hand slipped from his grasp, Ethan knew that Null had won. Desperation took root in him, deep and consuming, and he threw himself back into his work with a fervor that bordered on madness. Days blurred, each one an endless descent into the dark labyrinth of his mind, searching for a cure, a vaccine, anything that could reverse the virus effects. And then, one night, he found it. A sequence, a tiny anomaly buried within Null's genome, a thread he hadn't noticed before. It was a vulnerability, a chink in the virus's armor, something that could be exploited. His hands shook as he worked, adrenaline and grief mixing into a volatile fuel that kept him going, pushing him past exhaustion. He was close, so close, each step bringing him closer to the cure, closer to a future he could no longer imagine. Then a sharp pain pierced behind his eyes, searing, blinding. He stumbled, gripping the edge of the table, blinking as his vision began to blur. His surroundings dimmed, shadows creeping into the edges of his sight, creeping inward like dark tendrils swallowing the light. "No," he whispered, panic flaring, his voice raw. "Not yet." He forced himself back to the work, his fingers fumbling as his vision narrowed to a single point, a dwindling pinprick of light. He fought against the darkness, his mind racing to remember the formulas, the sequences, the answers slipping from him like sand through his fingers. With his last ounce of sight, he reached for the vial, the one Head worked so hard to create, holding it in trembling hands. He could barely see it, his vision fading, his world sinking into the same black void that had consumed everyone else. In the final moments, he injected himself, feeling the cool sting of the needle, hoping that this small act would save him, would bring him back from the brink. But the darkness swallowed him whole, leaving him adrift in a silence that was vast and endless. His last sight, a memory of his family, lost to him now in a world without light. Ethan was blind, and though he was so close to the answer, so close to ending Null, he was left wandering alone in the void Head fought so hard to escape.